Let's make sure this is, okay, we're live and we're on. So we're in the middle of chapter 24. I believe we're at page 324, the 15th of Shvat. And we've been discussing what happens when a person commits a sin. That any sin a person commits, they are disconnecting themselves from Hashem. Yeah? That's what we were discussing in this chapter. Okay, so how is it possible, if we discussed in chapters 18 and 19 that every single Jew has a Jewish soul, and this soul is ready to give up its life, not to be disconnected from God, right? When it comes to idolatry, where obviously if you serve an idol, you're severing your connection to God. Every Jew is willing to give up their life. But if I perform any sin, I'm severing my connection to God. So how is it that we proved in chapters 18 and 19 that if I'm going to sever my connection to God, I'm willing to give up my life for it, and yet when it comes to eating a cheeseburger, which I'm severing my connection to God, and I'm not willing to give up my life for it. I'm willing to do it even if I just want it. If I'm just in the mood. How does that happen, right? Okay, so we're going to answer that there is something called a spirit of folly. In other words, we're fooling ourselves. Now, when you fool yourself, it could be for a number of reasons. And it could sound, when you say you're fooling yourself, that you're like a foolish person that doesn't know how to think straight. We're not saying that the person is a fool. Well, you can think whatever, but we're saying that the thought process that leads to a sin is a foolish thought process. Okay, so let's see what the Alter Rebbe says here. He quotes from the Talmud. Okay, this is in the middle, the second to last paragraph on page 324. This explains the commentary of our sages on the verse, if a man's wife turns aside and commits adultery. Now, the word in the Hebrew, if you look, is ki sista or tista ishto. Okay, when his wife turns away. But if you change the sin into a shin, that reads tishta. Not drinking, because that would be a tough at the end. Tishta means like from shota. You know what a shota is?
Not the sota.
No, the sota is this woman. A shota is an incompetent person. Okay, so a legally incompetent person. So for example, a shota can't legally get married because they don't have the wherewithal to acquire something or to be acquired, if it, depending on if it's the male or the female. A shota can't legally acquire property or possession. There's many things, right? They're not obligated in mitzvahs because they're just not capable of being. That's the way God created them.
You would say today it's challenged.
Well, it depends what level of challenge. There are legal parameters. If they know how to do calculations, they're not legal. They're not. We're talking about someone who's literally. I mean, today the words that you would use to describe them are not socially accepted. But someone who's crazy, who just doesn't have, isn't able to make competent decisions and isn't able to. Okay, so in other words, the Talmud says that when it says this woman turns aside and commits adultery, how could she commit adultery? Or why would she commit adultery? If she would die and not to commit idolatry, so why is she just, because her heart lusts, she's committing adultery? It's also a sin. So what does the Talmud say? No man commits any transgression unless a spirit of folly has entered into him. And Alter Rebbe explains, for even an adulterous woman with her frivolous nature could have controlled her passionate drive were it not for the spirit of folly within her. How do we know this? Because she would have given up her life not to serve an idol. So we know she's capable of withholding her temptation. Now, we're putting all the blame on her, because she's the one that's married, right? Now the person who was with her also dies if they sin because he slept with a married woman. It's just as much, but because she's the one that was married, she's the one that turned away from. So it sort of, she gets categorized in this mitzvah. So even her, if it weren't for the spirit of folly, which covers, on page 325, which covers and conceals the hidden love within her divine soul that yearns to cleave to her faith in God and to his unity and oneness, and that resists even the pain of death. This same woman would have resisted the pain of death to resist any separation from his unity through idol worship. In other words, even this adulteress would willingly sacrifice her life rather than submit to coercion to practice idolatry. Yeah. Even if this idol worship would consist merely of an empty act of prostrating herself before the idolized object without any belief in her heart in the validity of the idol worship. So she's being forced just so people thinks she's worshiping an idol, even if she doesn't actually believe. So she would nevertheless die instead of doing that. Now, if her hidden love of God has the power to enable her to face death rather than be separated from him, surely then it is within its power to overcome the temptation and lust for adultery, which is lighter suffering than death. May God protect us. Yeah? In other words, for a person not to give in to their lustful temptation is much easier than dying, than be willing to die, right? So if she's willing to die, then why isn't she willing to? Obviously, she doesn't think that it's as severe, but we know it is as severe. So how is she So she's fooling herself that it's not as severe. In other words, it's a spirit of folly that's telling her, "Don't worry, you're not such a bad person if you do this," and that's why she's willing to do it. If she would know the truth that it's just as bad to commit adultery as idolatry, she would never do it. Just an anecdote. There was a famous journalist, or I don't know if it's a journalist, a writer in Israel, very, very secular, and not just secular, very anti. I don't know if he was anti-religious people, but very anti-religion. And there was a Yiddish newspaper, Allgemeiner Journal. It exists now in Yiddish and maybe even in English also, the Allgemeiner Journal. Today, it's the only Yiddish. Allgemeiner means like all-encompassing. It was a Yiddish newspaper, and I think they still publish it today. So Rabbi Jacobson, he was a Chabad chassid. He ran the newspaper. It wasn't a Chabad newspaper in any way, shape, or form. Nothing in it. I mean, they would post Chabad talks from the Rebbe and things, but they had the most vicious anti-religious people writing articles. It was a newspaper, a neutral platform. And so because he was a journalist, he was friendly with this anti-religious journalist. Again, I don't know if he was anti-religious people. He was not a religious person, and vehemently so. So he was visiting America, and he was staying at Rabbi Jacobson's house during the high holy days. So I don't think he went to shul on Rosh Hashanah, but after Rosh Hashanah, at the end of every holiday, the Rebbe would hold a Hasidic gathering. And the Rebbe would wash for bread. Afterwards, the Rebbe would do the grace after meals on a glass of wine. If you have a minyan, you lead the benching on a glass of wine. And then after Ma'ariv, the Rebbe would make the Havdalah. And in the code of Jewish law, it speaks about a cup of blessing, that if someone makes a blessing on a cup, it is a blessing to drink from their cup. Okay? So that's why Kiddush, today, people are very into germs and everything, so everyone gets their own shot glass. Growing up, our family would just drink from my father's Kiddush cup, and even the guests at the table, my father would pour from his cup after he would drink. Today, no one would drink from it afterwards, but growing up, that's what you did. So the Rebbe would stand for 3, 4, 5 hours sometimes after making Havdalah and pouring from his glass of wine at anyone who wanted. So Rabbi Jacobson offered this journalist to come with him to receive some wine. So he came to the Rebbe, and when the Rebbe saw him, the Rebbe said, "I read your articles So, so he asked the Rebbe, "Do you agree with them?" So the Rebbe said, "If I only read the things I agreed with, I'd be left with not much to read." So he had a chuckle. He took it. He received wine. He was going to go, and then the Rebbe turned to him and asked him, "And what's with Yirat Shamayim?" You know what Yirat Shamayim is? Fear of heaven. So this journalist said, like the story of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev. Code. He didn't elaborate. The Rebbe knew which story he was talking about because he explained afterwards. He was referring to a story in which there was a Jew that was smoking on Yom Kippur, and he was accused of it, and he admitted it. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Barditchev said, "Look, God, that your Jews are honest, even though they were caught smoking on Yom Kippur. They admitted that they wouldn't say a lie. Yeah, he smoked on Yom Kippur, but he wouldn't say a lie. So basically, he was saying, I'm honest, that I'm not God-fearing. You know, I'm not religious. At least I don't lie about it." So the Rebbe said, again, he didn't say the story. He just said like the story of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. So the Rebbe said that story is good to justify someone else's behavior. But it's not, you can't use that story to justify your own behavior. And that was the end of the conversation. And then the Rebbe said that he should never leave an empty, if he has space in a newspaper, he should continue writing. As long as he has that power, he should continue writing. Okay. A few months later, this is 1979, a few months later, he got sick. He was still in New York, and he got sick. He ended up dying from his illness, but when he was in the hospital, so Rabbi Jacobson came to visit him, and he gave Rabbi Jacobson an envelope, and he said he feels that his days are numbered. After he dies, whenever that is, he should open the envelope, and he wrote a column he should if he could publish it after he dies. And that's what he did. He passed away not long after, and Rabbi Jacobson published his column. And in the column, he described this episode that he had with the Rebbe after Rosh Hashanah by receiving the cup of blessing. And then he writes, and you're asking, why am I sharing this? You know, after so many years of one kind of writing, why am I sharing this with you today? So because I've obviously passed if the article is being published, which means that I'm probably standing in front of the heavenly court. And if anyone does a mitzvah in my merit, that would probably help my case. In other words, every Jew deep down has a certain red line that they know that if you cross that red line, you're renouncing your Judaism, and no Jew is willing to do that. Even Jews that have done the worst of the worst somehow were able to justify that this doesn't renounce my Judaism. The problem is that everything else before that accomplishes the same thing. The person just convinces himself that it doesn't. Yeah, that's the spirit of folly. The spirit of folly is that I think it's not separating, but really it is. Oh, so now the question is, really? Every sin is just as bad as idolatry? What about the fact that you have to give up your life for idolatry? You don't have to for putting on tefillin or eating kosher. The punishment for idolatry is death. The punishment for not eating kosher is not death. So there must be a hierarchy of sin. So maybe it's not a spirit of folly. Maybe there's a rational reason that does distinguish between mitzvahs. And sorry, let me sleep this. How do I sleep it? Oh, focus. Okay. So there's a story that there was a rabbi, a distinguished person, lived in Jerusalem, died maybe 10, 20 years ago, and maybe a little longer. And he was very friendly with everyone. He was once talking to a group of kids, and one of the kids had a fly in his hand. And he goes over to Rabbi, his name was Rabbi Aryeh Levine. He was known as the Tzaddik of Yerushalayim. He goes over to Rabbi Levine and he says, is the fly that I have in my hand dead or alive? And the idea is, if you say it's alive, you squeeze your hand, open it, and it's dead. And if you say it's dead, you open it, and the fly flies away. So he asked the tzaddik, is it dead or alive? So the tzaddik says, it all depends on your hand. It depends on you. It's all in your hands. In Hebrew, it sounds better. Hakol biyadcha. It's all in your hand. When you say it's up to you, you say biyadcha. It's all in your hands. So, who's better, or who's worth more? The human holding the fly or the fly? Sounds like an odd question. Obviously, the human holding the fly, but we'll soon see. It depends. We discussed that the woman, the adulterous woman, we know she could have withstood her temptation because she would have given up her life for idolatry. But is that true? In other words, is it, of course she would have given up her life for idolatry, but is it true that that she did it because it was foolish to commit the sin? She might say, and by the way, we hear this from people we meet, and sometimes we hear ourselves saying it too, that I'm going to eat this even though it's not 100% kosher because it's not the same as bowing down to an idol. I'll never bow down to an idol, but this isn't as bad. So this justification that it's not as bad, this is only rabbinic, this is only a custom, this is only, right? Maybe it's not as bad. This justification, you don't need the adulterous woman to say. Everyone says it at some point or another, in one way or another. So I mentioned before that there are two types of foolish thoughts. One is where a person actually forgets, not forgets. In other words, they have this hidden love, this intrinsic love to God, and right now they're just so caught up in their desire that they're like a child. Sometimes when even an adult, you see an adult gets like all excited, they like get a little immature, they forget their adultness, they get carried away in the temptation. So she got carried away. That's like fool. That would be the usual connotation of foolishness. They get carried away in childish behavior or childish play. However, there's another type of foolish idea, and that is that, let's say this person is aware of what to do, that this is a sin, and therefore they don't want to do it because it's going to separate them from God. Because remember, we discussed it. A mitzvah connects you to God. A sin separates you from God. So this is a sin that separates me from God. But the evil inclination doesn't let go. He comes back with a response. He says, "Really? You separate your soul when you're going to commit the sin? You can't compare idolatry to this small sin." Now, based on what we said before, there's no difference. If a sin separates you from God, there's no difference between a small sin and a big sin. But if there is a small sin and big sin, that means that either the separation isn't as great, or a small sin won't necessarily separate. So which way is it? So let's see, the Alter Rebbe addresses these as sort of comeback from the person who the spirit of folly entered them. Page 326. The distinction she makes between the prohibition against idolatry and that against adultery is also but a spirit of folly stemming from the klipa. Yet, the spirit of folly envelops the divine soul only up to, but not including, its faculty of chachma, which, as explained in chapter 18, represents the power of faith in God. This faith is unaffected by the spirit of folly, because of the divine light that is clothed in the faculty of chachma, as explained above. So, in other words, it doesn't extinguish her love for God, the spirit of folly. She still has it inside. And the proof is, if right after she commits adultery, you tell her bow down to an idol, what's she going to say? No. So it's not that this godly soul and love for God has been distinguished. It's just been basically covered up, right? It has been put in exile, almost been confined, that it can't express itself. But the spirit of folly only has that much room. Once it gets to idolatry, the spirit of folly has no justification. So then the love comes out because there's no foolish thought you can possibly tell yourself that it's not so bad. In truth, however, even he who commits a minor sin transgresses the divine will, and he is completely sundered from God's unity and oneness, even more than the Sitra Achra and Klipa, which are called strange gods and idolatry, since Klipa does not violate God's will, whereas he does. Okay. I'm going to stop in the middle of the paragraph because I don't know if you remember. If you remember last time we spoke about that strange gods and idolatry, Klipa really isn't bad in and of itself, right? Klipa is a God's creation. It's when the person engages with Klipa, when the person commits the sin, that he takes this Klipa and makes it evil, makes it bad, right? So who's better, the human or the mosquito, the fly? Well, so the story, we use the story of a fly, but let's use the terminology that the Talmud uses, a mosquito. The Gemara asks this question. The Talmud asks this question: what's greater, or who's better, the person or the fly, the mosquito? And the Talmud says it depends. If a person sins, the mosquito is greater. The mosquito comes first, is the terminology that's used. Now, what does that mean? What's the Gemara saying? The Gemara is saying literally that in creation, human was created last. Now, the reason human was created last is because God built a home, right? He built a world, he created a world. When does the person move into the home? After it's completed. So God creates the human when the home is complete. So in other words, the human was created last, yeah, but who is the greatest? Who is the purpose of everything for? You have to look at the last. Whatever the last is, that's the ultimate goal, that's the purpose, yeah? But ultimately, who's created first? The mosquito was created before the human being. So the Talmud says it's possible for a mosquito, if a person sins, the mosquito came first. We say the mosquito is better than you. But there's something additional here. First of all, why does the Talmud speak about a mosquito? Why not a lion, a tiger? What's a mosquito? So the Talmud says that a mosquito has something that makes it the lowest of the animals. And that is that this mosquito takes in, but doesn't excrete, doesn't give anything out. Animals, we mentioned last time, we're going to mention it again right now. Animals come from klipa. What does that mean? That they have they feel themselves in existence and not God. In other words, anything that's godly is godly. Anything that's not godly is klipa. So animals automatically are klipa, because what does an animal feel? An animal feels itself. What does it mean when a person feels itself? Let's say ego. Let's use the term ego. What does that mean? It means the more ego you have, the more you take and the less you give. The less ego you have, the more you give and the less you take. So if you want to know how selfish a person is, look at how much he gives versus how much he takes. Yeah, the Mishnah in Ethics of the Father says if someone who says what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine is a Rosh, and someone who says what's mine is yours and what's yours is a Chassid, right? Because the parameter of how selfish and selfless of a person you are is how much you give compared to how much you take. Now, impure animals, those non-kosher animals, even those, now we don't know exactly, not all non-kosher animals kill other animals, are carnivores, right? Not all of them. There are no kosher animals that are carnivores, but not all non-kosher animals are. And same thing with birds. But one thing is for sure, even those animals and birds that do kill other animals, and even the most vicious of them, there are certain animals they won't touch, whether it's their own species or their own family, right? So even if lions will kill other lions, they won't necessarily kill their own brothers or their own children, right? So even the most vicious of animals will give, even those who take will also give. So even though they're selfish in that sense, they're not entirely selfish. Whereas a mosquito, according to the Talmud, is entirely selfish. It only takes and doesn't give. Okay. This element of only taking and not giving is the exact opposite of godliness. Kedusha. Kedusha gives and asks for nothing in return. All it wants to do is perform God's will. It doesn't want to take anything. Most of Klippa gives and takes. It's just a spectrum. The mosquito is at the other end of the spectrum, that it only takes and doesn't give. So when we say that a person is worse than a mosquito, or comparing a person to a mosquito, in other words, what we're saying is that a person that doesn't sin, a person that only does mitzvahs can include mitzvahs like chesed shel emet, kindness of truth, which is burying the dead, or giving charity and hiding where you can't be thanked for it, right? These are mitzvahs that there's only giving and no receiving. And then at the other spectrum you have, when a person commits a sin, they are worse than the mosquito. Why? Because even the mosquito that takes and doesn't give, that's the way God created them. It says, right, even non-Jews who come from the souls of non-Jews come from Klippa. At the end of the day, most of them don't violate God's will, especially in today's day and age. And even in ancient times when you had pagans, they violated one of the 7 Noahide laws. But some of the other ones they may have kept. So percentage-wise, they kept a lot of their mitzvahs. Whereas a Jew has 613. So you have to keep, right? There's a lot more that can go wrong in a Jew's adhering to what Hashem says. Whereas a non-Jew, again, especially today, for the most part, is doing what Hashem wants. And the same thing is for animals. An animal can only do what Hashem wants. An animal, so a non-Jew has 7 mitzvahs, so they very rarely do against what Hashem wants. How many mitzvahs does an animal have? None. So technically an animal has a mitzvah. Although it wasn't given to the animal, it was told to human beings, but an animal does have a mitzvah. And the mitzvah is what Hashem told, was it Adam or Cain? Adam, I think, right? Hashem said that your fear will be on the animals of the world. In other words, the animals will fear you. That's what it says in Bereshis, right? Your fear will be on the animals of the world. And the Talmud proves this from the world. You have, it says, a baby that's alive and mice run away from it. And then you have Og the giant who's dead and mice eat away at his body. So you have a giant who's a mighty warrior, and if he's dead, mice won't be afraid of it. You have a little baby that can't hurt a mouse that's alive, and mice don't touch it. In other words, there's a nature and a mitzvah God gave to animals to be afraid of people. So you'll say, yeah, but sometimes animals hurt people. Even if it's not killing people, at least hurting people, scaring. So animals could scare people. And the Gemara asks this question, right? This is a good question. And the Gemara says, that's not true. No animal ever hurts a person. Because an animal can't. An animal's afraid of a person. So how could it be that an animal hurts a person? It must be that person sinned. If the person sins, that means he gave into his temptation. Now he's an animal. Now the animal has nothing to be afraid of. What does it say when after Cain killed Abel, right? He was scared that the animals would kill him. So what did God do? It says God carved out, right, the
Mark,
mark on his forehead. In other words, Cain lost his image of God because he committed a sin. Now he was free. He was free game. The animals could have killed him. So God does him a favor and puts back God's image on him, even though he sinned for 7 generations. What happened 7 generations later? He was killed. Right, his grandson he was killed. The point is that as long as the human being retains his humanity, in other words, he does what God wants, he controls his impulses. He's not an animal. The animals are afraid of him, and he'll never be hurt. This is how the Zohar explains the story of Daniel in the you know the story, right? So usually, how do we understand the story? God performed a miracle. It was a miracle. It was miraculous. The Zohar says it wasn't a miracle. It was nature. Daniel was a tzaddik. He was a human being. So the animals couldn't touch him. They were afraid of him. That's the nature. God, right? God puts his nature in Genesis. God says, I will place the fear of humans into the animals. So as long as you're a human, there's no problem. There's actually maybe let's read this inside, and I'll share with you a story or two that brings out both extremes. Okay, so let's start in the middle of 3. You know what? Let's go back to the bottom of 326. In truth, however, even he who commits a minor sin transgresses the divine will, and he is completely sundered from God's unity and oneness, even more than the Sitra Achra and Klipa, which are called strange gods and idolatry, since Klipa does not violate God's will. Right? Klipa is matter. Klipa can't violate God's will. Whereas he does, the human being could violate God's will. And more than all things of this world that are derived from them. Namely, the unclean cattle, beasts and birds, and the vermin and reptiles, which all receive their life force from the 3 completely unclean klipot, and yet they can't violate God's will. But the human being could. As our sages have said, when a man sins, he is told, the gnat preceded you. This means that even the gnat, which as the Talmud states, consumes food, but does not excrete, indicating a klipa, which is the height of selfishness. It does not give anything of itself, which, as we explained, is the very lowest form of klipa and is far removed from holiness, basically the opposite, which holiness characteristically gives of itself, even to those far from it. For holiness implies humility, which leads to kindness and to benevolence, even to those who don't deserve it, while klipa represents egocentricity and selfishness. Now, even the very lowest klipa, symbolized by the gnat, takes precedence over the sinner in the order of descent of the divine life force from the divine will. Now, if he's lower than the gnat, and surely the other unclean creatures and even the ferocious beasts are higher than the sinner. All of these do not deviate from their divinely intended purpose, but obey God's command, although they cannot perceive it. For the animal cannot perceive God's command, yet their spirit perceives it. As it is written, and this is Genesis 9:2, the fear and dread of you shall lie upon every beast of the earth. And as our sages explain, a wild beast will never defy a human being unless he appears to it like an animal. In fact, when confronting tzaddikim from whose face the divine image never departs, the evil beasts are humbled before them, as it is stated in the Zohar concerning Daniel in the lion's den. And therefore, it is thus clear that he who sins and transgresses against God's will, even in a minor offense, is at the time he commits it, completely removed from the divine holiness, meaning God's unity and oneness. Even more so than all the unclean creatures, the vermin and the reptiles, which derive their sustenance from the Sitra Achra and the Klipa of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry. 2 short stories to illustrate this. So first of all, you know the story of Titus, after he destroyed the temple? He was the general, right, that destroyed the temple. On his way back to Rome, he was on a boat, on a ship, and he sort of challenged God. He was boasting that he destroyed God's home. He's the king of the world. So God sends a mighty wind to capsize the ship. So he says, you have control over the water. You don't have control over the land. We're trying to fight me on land. So a heavenly voice came out and said, go on land and you'll see even a gnat, even a mosquito you won't be able to fight even against a mosquito. And when he came ashore, a mosquito flew into his nostril and ate away at his brain. And after a while, he started getting a lot of pain. And he noticed that when he would pass a blacksmith, the pain would go down. So he brought a blacksmith into the palace, and the blacksmith would bang away. And as long as there was noise, he wasn't in pain. After a while, the pain started coming back. Anyhow, he eventually died. And when he died, it says they opened his head, and a mosquito the size of a pigeon flew out. In other words, the mosquito was scared of the noise, and when the noise afterwards, he got used to it, he continued eating away at Titus's brain. Whether this is a metaphoric story or not is irrelevant. The point is that this illustrates that the mosquito is at the end of the day a messenger of God, is a creature of God that does what God created it to do. On the other hand, you have a number of stories from the Or HaChaim, which lived in Sfat, and then there was also Avram Galanti. He was a famous Jew that lived in Israel, and in those days, this is going back 400 or 500 years, or maybe a little sooner, 350 years, whatever it was. The Jewish community in Israel had no way to survive. Really, they survived on the contributions from those in the diaspora. The oldest charity in existence today is Kol Chabad, the charity that the Alter Rebbe started to support the Hasidim that moved to Israel. So every once in a while, someone would go from Israel to then it was Turkey to collect money for the Jews in Israel. So he went on a boat to Turkey. When he comes to Istanbul, they see from afar that the streets are empty and the soldiers are chasing people into their homes. So the boat, anyway, a whole long story, he made it to shore. And when he comes to shore, the soldiers are telling him to get off the street. Two hungry lions escaped the king's zoo, whatever it was. He doesn't seem to care. And suddenly the soldiers spot one of the lions from a distance. They all run onto the rooftops. And he's standing there. The lion comes, and when the lion approaches him, the lion kneels. Takes the lion by his ear. They walk down the street until they meet the next lion, and he takes both of them back to the lion's den, back to the zoo. When they come back to the zoo, the king, he's watching. The king's also locked up in his palace because he can't leave. When he sees this, he's amazed, right? This person is so he wanted to know what type of tricks he has up his sleeve. So he explained them that it wasn't a trick. It says in the Torah that the animals are scared of people. As long as you're a person the way God created you, in other words, with the image of God, animals can't touch you. And he gave him a lot of money to support the Jews in Israel. This is just, there are a number of stories like this. The Or HaChaim has a story like that. The point is that when a person, in other words, going back, this is the justification that she's giving herself, right? That there's a difference between sins. Really, there isn't. Any sin a person commits, the Talmud says, makes him lower than a mosquito. Really, there is no distinction. Okay. However, there is another more, not halachic question per se, but a more of a Talmudic question. In other words, even if the adulterous woman is not going to ask this question, the rabbi sitting in the study hall can ask this question. That is a halachic difficulty that poses a problem to this assumption that there's no difference between the mitzvahs, that every mitzvah has the same effect of separating the person from God. And that is, first of all, the Torah does seem to separate, as we mentioned in the beginning, between idolatry and other sins, right? on the one hand, you have when there's a risk to life. Yeah, so even though in idolatry, even if they're threatening your life, you have to be killed. When it comes to Shabbos, for example, you violate the Shabbos. If someone's life is at risk, you violate the Shabbos. So obviously, it's not as bad. If I have to give up my life for idolatry, in other words, idolatry has an effect on my life, Shabbos obviously doesn't. If it would, I'd have to give up my life for that too. That's the halachic thought process. And then, as we mentioned, from the punishments, idolatry has the death penalty. There are many mitzvahs that don't have a death penalty, or even if they have the death penalty, not the death penalty by court, which is more severe than the death penalty by God. So how can we say that there's no distinction? So the Alter Rebbe is going to address these questions next. And so when it comes to the first question about giving up your life, so the sages say, why is a person obligated to violate the Shabbos to save a life? You know what it says in the Talmud? Why a person is obligated to violate the Shabbos to save a life? Because the Shabbos is a death penalty case. So why? I know you receive the death penalty for violating the Shabbos. So why are you allowed to do it to save a life?
God says that you present before your life and death, choose life.
No, that's not the reason. Because if that was the reason, then you would violate. Then you would save your life and commit idolatry. You're saving your life, right? So the sages say the reason is because if you want to be able to keep Shabbos next week, you better violate the Shabbos this week. If you're going to die this week because you're not going to violate the Shabbos, you're not going to be here, that's it. You're going to stop keeping Shabbos. You want to be able to keep Shabbos, yeah? In other words, Shabbos is interested that you violate it. That's what the sages say. Shabbos has an interest in you violating it because if you don't violate it, it won't be observed anymore by this person. They won't be around. Another point, if we're going to measure a mitzvah by what you desecrate in order to save a life, then we would have to find the same thing in other areas. So for example, when it comes to Shabbos, when it comes to dying, so for adultery, do you have to give up your life not to commit adultery? Yeah, it's one of the three things Maimonides says: idolatry, adultery, and murder. Okay, so if someone says, I'll kill you if you don't kill someone else, you die. If someone says, I'll kill you if you don't serve idolatry, you die. If someone says, I'll kill you if you don't commit adultery, now what is included in adultery isn't every forbidden. You know, the Torah lists a whole bunch of forbidden relationships. Not all of them are included in the obligation to kill yourself for adultery. But whatever is included in adultery is you give up your life for it. Okay, so Shabbos, if someone says violate the Shabbos or I'll kill you, do you have to die? No, right? Because you violate the Shabbos if your life is in danger. Okay, so what is worse, adultery or Shabbos? Violating Shabbos or committing adultery? Which one's worse? I know, but one of them you're obligated to give up your life for, one of them you're not, right? If you commit adultery,
Give up your life.
you know, if you're threatened with your life to commit adultery, you give up your life. If you're threatened with your life to violate the Shabbos, you violate the Shabbos. So it would seem logically that adultery is worse than Shabbos. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a different law. It says that you can trust a Jew who claims to be a kosher slaughterer. You can trust him unless he is someone who violates the Shabbos publicly in other words, he's someone who doesn't keep Shabbos. If he doesn't keep Shabbos, you can't trust his shechita. What about someone who keeps the Shabbos but commits adultery? In other words, he's careless when it comes to adultery. You could still trust the shechita. So which one's worse? Adultery or Shabbos? Here, Shabbos disqualifies him, adultery doesn't. So the point is, you cannot judge the heaviness or lightness of a mitzvah necessarily based on its punishment, or based on those things don't necessarily tell you what's worse and what isn't. In other words, why do you violate the Shabbos to save your life and you don't commit adultery to save your life? Because that's what God said. If it would be rational, because this is greater than this, then it would always be greater. Obviously, this is the way God wanted it. Well, in other words, the scale of the fact that this mitzvah doesn't get a big punishment, this one does, right? That's because God wanted it that way. But you can't deter. In other words, the fact that we see differences in mitzvahs doesn't necessarily tell us that our previous assumption that every sin disconnects you from God is false. It doesn't mean it's false. It could be true. There's different punishments. We'll explain that soon. Maybe let's explain that now before we go further. So why are there different punishments? So maybe one explains the other. The Alter Rebbe says we have to make a distinction between the act of the sin and the consequences of the sin. Right? The act of violating God's will, of committing a sin, is the same regardless of which sin you commit. Whether, right, just like a child is given an instruction by their parent or their teacher, whether it's an instruction to sit down or to get out of the street, they're both instructions that the child is given by the parent or the teacher. And if the child remains standing or stays in the street, they both violated the instruction they were given. However, which one is going to get the bigger punishment? One went in the street and didn't listen to go out of the street, right? Because standing seems to be a trivial thing. And it is a trivial thing. But the act, in other words, the fact that the child disobeyed the teacher or the parent, the same act, the same severity in the act itself. What was accomplished through the act varies greatly. The act of standing in the middle of the street threatened the kid's life. The act of standing when the child was told to sit doesn't really threaten much. Therefore, the punishment for going in the street is going to be severe. The punishment for standing, depending on what the circumstances are, may not even exist. But at the end of the day, the child is going to have a talking from the parent or the teacher on listening to the parent or the teacher, regardless of what they committed. Because that act of not listening was the same regardless.
Being defiant of what was being instructed.
Right. So the effect of the sin varies greatly. In the analogy of the child, the long-term effect of standing and not sitting there may not be any effect. There may not be any repercussions from standing and not sitting because the child may have not done nothing negative was accomplished because of it. Whereas standing in the middle of the street may have dire consequences. The child may get hit by a car. Right? So yes, we do have differences when it comes to mitzvahs and sins regarding their result. Yeah. Let's say a positive mitzvah. You have a mitzvah that is long-lasting. We're coming to Rosh Hashanah, the mitzvah of shofar. The mitzvah of shofar lasts us an entire year. The mitzvah of tefillin lasts us an entire day. The mitzvah of bris lasts us an entire lifetime. So if you don't give a bris, you get death by kares, right? You get death by God. You don't put on tefillin, that's another level. You don't hear shofar, that's another level, right? Because there's a variance with regard to the long-term effect of the mitzvah. The same thing is with a sin. There are sins that affect certain, let's say I hit someone, that was my hand. That didn't affect my feet necessarily. My feet weren't necessarily affected by that sin. Whereas there are sins that affect my entire body, sins that affect my soul. Let's say I did a sin, but I didn't even realize I was doing it, or I didn't want to do it. My soul wasn't affected. My body was. So the punishment is going to be less because less was affected, right? So punishment and reward that comes from a sin only tells us the long-term effect of the sin. Whereas the act of the sin is equal by every sin. The act of the mitzvah is equal by every mitzvah. And that's why every mitzvah connects you to God, because you just did what God wanted, not what you wanted. In other words, you were selfless, not selfish. You were godly and not klipa. Because by definition, klipa is selfish. Godliness is selfless. You do what God wants. That act itself, regardless of how big or small it was, that was an act of selflessness. A sin, regardless of what it was selfish, and therefore separates you from God. The question is, what does it separate? Does it separate only my hand, only temporarily, for long term, etc.? That varies. Okay, so that will depend on the punishment and the tshuva and everything else. But the act itself, that's equal by everything. It's an act of separation from God. And it doesn't matter if adultery, idolatry, or speaking negative about someone else. No difference. Let's look in the words of the Alter Rebbe. Okay. Page 330. Yeah. The Alter Rebbe is going to address this question. True, we find the principle that saving a life overrides other prohibitions, though not the prohibition of idolatry. And similarly, right? So the saving a life overrides those prohibitions. And similarly, the law sometimes calls for one to commit a transgression rather than be killed. Whereas with idolatry, incest, and murder, the law requires that he submit to death rather than commit any one of the three. So it seems like there is a grading of the mitzvahs. So the Alter Rebbe explains, this fact that saving a life overrides other prohibitions is because, as the sages explain, the Torah declares, desecrate one Shabbat for his sake, so that he may live to observe other Shabbatot. In other words, it is not because of the relative leniency of the Shabbat or gravity of the sins, such as idolatry, that one is waived while the other is not. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to prove it, right? So it has nothing to do with how severe it is. It has to do with the fact that that's what Torah says. The Torah says that Shabbos cares for next week and not just this week. How do we know this? So in brackets here, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain. This contention is supported by the following fact. Violation of the Shabbat is a grave offense and comparable to idolatry with regard to the law of shechita. That's ritual slaughter by anyone who habitually violates a particular precept, as codified in Yoreh De'ah, section 2. In other words, anyone who habitually violates idolatry or the desecration of Shabbos can't be trusted to slaughter. A habitual sexual offender, on the other hand, does not have the same law applied to him as a habitual idolater, indicating that the violation of Shabbat is greater than sexual offenses. And yet, the consideration of life overrides Shabbat, but not the sexual prohibitions. Rather, so what do we conclude from this? Rather, it is a scriptural decree that consideration of life overrides other sins, but not the three cardinal sins: idolatry, sexual offense, and murder. This is, by the way, something that is a misconception by many people, that the Torah values life so much at the expense of mitzvahs, and therefore we will justify anything to save a life. That's not necessarily true. The Torah values mitzvahs. God said, for most mitzvahs, I want you to value life more. But if God would value life more than any mitzvah, he would value life more than idolatry, adultery, and murder. So the fact that he doesn't means that it's not life he values necessarily. It's the mitzvahs he values. But he says, I'm willing to forego the value of most mitzvahs for the value of life. But not because inherently life is great. God created life, God created the mitzvahs. They're all God's creations. God can choose. God could have created the world in a way that life has zero value. God chose to give life value, and God chose to give life value in certain circumstances. When it comes to renouncing your faith, God says, then life has zero value. And then the court can go and kill you because your life has no value anymore. When a person commits certain sins, that life has the same God that gave life value says this life has no value, or this life isn't life anymore, and therefore this person is valueless. Okay. we'll stop here. We're not really finished, and we don't have much left of the chapter, but it's going to take more than 2-3 minutes to finish. And so we'll probably start again on page. We'll probably start from page 332, although we'll have to revisit briefly, at least before, to get back into the context. Okay, God willing, we'll see you next week. Unless something comes up and you can't make it, let me know. Otherwise, we will plan on next week. And let me end this recording.